This is Talking Drupal, a weekly chat about web design and development from a group of people with one thing in common. We love Drupal. This is episode 315, Communities, Drupal versus WordPress. Can we call this round two? Welcome to Talking Drupal. Today we're talking about what the Drupal and WordPress communities can learn from one another with Tara King. Tara is a longtime Drupal contributor. Tara's been using Drupal since 2012. She's on the leadership team for the Drupal Diversity and Inclusion Group and founded the Drupal Diversity and Inclusion Contribution Team. Currently, she's working as the Director of Developer Relations at Automatic, working to make Gutenberg the best way to create content on the web. Formerly, she worked for Pantheon, Universal Music Group, and more. Tara, welcome to the show, and thank you for joining us again.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
I'm Nick Laughlin, and today my co-hosts are, as usual, John Bicozzi. What's new with you?
Oh, internet things. I made a purchase a couple months, probably like in August, like mid to late August. I bought a domain name, which everybody's like, yeah, so you bought a domain name, good for you. But I didn't just go to like Hover and buy a domain name. I like bought a domain name through like an escrow service because the domain name that I wanted was like, I don't know, special or more than just a regular domain name. But anyway, so after was it a month or so? Month and a half or so, I finally have my spiffy new domain name, which is bicozzi.com. It's something I've been looking at for a long time as far as like trying to get it. It was owned apparently by a company in Italy, and then they kind of let it lapse, and then somebody picked it up and held on to it, and then it got into kind of like a brokerage situation. But it was a very interesting process because throughout the whole process, you just feel shady because you're like, this feels like it could be a scam. This could be a scam. And then after going through the transfer process like 3 times and having it fail, or 4 times and having it fail the first 3 times, I was kind of like, I don't know, this doesn't feel like it's going to happen. And then it kind of figured itself out. So yes, I am now the proud owner of bicozzi.com.
Did you end up using escrow.com?
No, I used a service called Sedo, SEDO.com. And to be fair, it was actually really great. According to their website, they're based out of Cambridge, Massachusetts. So, it was super great and super easy in the way that they do things. So, I would recommend that again, I guess, because it worked out for me. But yeah, it basically, they just do what any, kind of escrow service does. They take your money, they hold it, they get the domain, they hold it. And then once everything works out, they transfer it, and then they give the person the money.
Oh, interesting. So that's different than the process that I use for a client. So we use escrow.com. We put the money in escrow, and then the company that owned the domain transferred it to us directly. And once there was proof of the transfer, escrow gave them the money. So
I think they do that. I think what Sedo does is they say, okay, we've got the money. Seller, enable transfer and send us the authorization code. And then through Hover, I was able to go in and use that authorization code too. So I don't think they're taking transfer, but again, the seller was using Network Solutions, and I don't know how anybody else feels about this, but Network Solutions is the worst. So they
were great when they were one of the first ones. They were great when they first came out 25, 30 years ago, but they're still stuck 25, 30 years ago.
Yeah. So this person, I don't know, they updated like name servers, or they transferred it to Network Solutions. Something happened, and Network Solutions is like, well, you're going to have to wait 60 days before you can transfer this again. So they were like, you can either wait 60 days or we can just like forget this whole thing. And I was like, I'll just wait the 60 days. Or they were like, you can wait 60 days, or you can open a network solutions account and transfer it into your account, because they could do an internal transfer, but they couldn't do an external transfer. I'm like, no, I'll wait the 60 days, whatever. Like, I don't need a network solutions account. And then miraculously, I guess they talked to somebody at Network Solutions and they were able to like waive that and transfer it to some other, I don't know. It was like,
I'm pretty sure it's ICANN rules, but they're like super weird how they're set up. But yeah, transfers are always painful.
Yeah.
So all in all, it ended up great. It was a little, it was a little nerve-wracking. You know, I'm happy to talk to anybody about it offline if they're interested in learning more.
So also joining us again this week, Tara, what's new with you?
What's new with me? So I finally switched my personal machine back to Linux after a few years on Mac this weekend. So that was exciting. I have, in the interim between the two Linux times, started using a software called Scrivener, which is for like novel writing and long form writing. Which is a great tool for that purpose, but it's not available on Linux. And also, I really wanted it to be version controlled, because like once you start using version control, you just want it for everything. So I managed to get that working with Wine and get that all set up this weekend. And now nice. I have a GitHub repository with a novel inside of it, which is totally what GitHub is for. So anyway, that's how I spent my weekend.
A novel that you are writing?
Yeah, it's not good, but yes, I'm writing like a sort of sci-fi-ish kind of novel.
I actually have a novel on Bitbucket, and I was toying with the idea, because I was always thinking about like how it would be to have maybe an open source or a collaborative writing thing like that, where people can open pull requests to modify things, or like even fork it to like change. Like, I've always thought that would be interesting, but I also know that I'm not a good enough writer to get the novel to a point where that would make sense. But then again, maybe I should just try it. That'd be a fun experiment, I think.
Yeah, I had the first draft of this novel. I wrote it in Markdown and put it on GitHub, and I got like one PR for my README file because I had some ASCII art that was broken. So somebody issued a PR to fix the ASCII art. And that was the only PR I ever got. Yeah, I totally had that same feeling. Like, this would be really cool. But then nobody I know who likes writing enough to care understands GitHub or Git.
Yeah.
And so it was like, I should have called you. I didn't know.
I mean, if you're willing to share those links in the show notes, we'd be happy to put them in the newsletter.
I'll have to think about it. I'll say I might send it privately. It's a very rough draft and I might be a little embarrassed by it.
That's very cool. It's very interesting. I'll be very curious to see that. So, what's new for me this week? So I just wanted to give a quick update on a project I'm working on. Actually, I got a client that's working on a design system for one of their clients. And we're actually looking at using native web components kind of across the board, because their design system needs to be platform agnostic. You know, the company's fairly large, has a bunch of different technologies in use, you know, the usual WordPress, Drupal, but a bunch of others as well. So you can't even be sure that PHP is running. So a lot of the theming tools that you're used to in Drupal, you know, they expect PHP to be there, or Node or something like that. So we're looking at building a totally platform agnostic component-based system. And, you know, native web components looks like the way that, you know, there's still some more discovery, but it looks like it's going to be the way that we're going to deliver that design system. So I'm pretty excited. I've worked with native web components in a couple of places, but never really generated them myself. So I'm pretty excited about that project. Looks like it's going to be a good learning experience. So we also have a module of the week this week, which I think was mentioned in your intro, Tara. So maybe you can talk a little bit about what Gutenberg is.
Yeah. So this was an obvious module of the week for me personally. The Gutenberg module is a port of the Gutenberg project to Drupal. So the Gutenberg project is about 3 years old now in the WordPress space, and it's essentially a new admin editor for people to enter content on WordPress, but you can also now use it on Drupal or any number of different systems. So it's a very visual way of representing what's happening. So when you enter in, you can do a lot more sort of visual layout kind of things. You can put duotone over an image and put some text on top and all kinds of fancy things. It's really the WordPress project in general, which we'll get into later, is a lot about putting power into the hands of the sort of end content creators. And that's what Gutenberg is really designed to do. So if you have ever wanted to try sort of a new way of having your folks enter content into the Drupal site, I feel like Gutenberg is a great thing to give a shot and see how it works.
It's interesting that this is the module, because as I was listening to your intro, the phrase or the sentence, working to make Gutenberg the best way to create content on the web, stood out to me, because typically I think people, when they hear Gutenberg, they think like, oh, that's WordPress only, or maybe that's just me. I don't know. I don't want to speak for anybody else, but the fact that it's something that other platforms can use, not just WordPress and Drupal, but other platforms is interesting as well.
Yeah. It's built in React. And right now I can say, I think the Tumblr team uses it. So it's in Tumblr, it's in WordPress. Obviously it's in Drupal. It's pretty flexible. So definitely heavily, you're not alone in thinking it's only a WordPress thing. But it is a more broad project than that.
I mean, not to jump into to make this the Gutenberg show, but I'm just curious if, if the team that's working on it and building it is like thinking of it as like, one of those projects like Symfony or Twig or something that like everybody else uses, and like you guys solve that, admin UX thing down the road.
Right. I think that would be amazing. Right now, there's definitely a strong focus on the WordPress community because it's the tool that's using it most. So I wouldn't say they're writing it like the Symfony team. I'm not on those teams, so I could be wrong. But when I talk to them, I think it is more focused on WordPress, but it is useful beyond that. And they're trying to make sure it is useful in that way.
Cool.
Yeah.
Great. So let's jump into our primary topic. So we're talking about the communities of Drupal and WordPress. So this isn't a debate about the platform necessarily. We do have a bit of a discussion about Drupal versus WordPress in episode 16. If you're a little bit more interested in maybe the pros and cons and the different flavors of the two different platforms, and you want to kind of hear some old school talking Drupal, episode 16 is the place to go. Today's discussion is more to talk about maybe what the two communities can learn from each other.
I was sort of hoping for a grudge match.
I mean, you're the guest. It could go anyway.
I take it back.
So let's start with a simple question. So you've been part of the Drupal community now for 9 years, since 2012. How long have you been part of the WordPress community?
Yeah, so I've been using WordPress longer than I've been in the community. My first WordPress event was, I want to say, 2016. So I'll just date it back to that, 5 years or so. So it's kind of a very different experience for me. Whereas in Drupal, when I went to my first Drupal event back in like 2012-ish, I pretty much got hooked and kept coming back. And with WordPress, I was entirely one of those like secret users that's just like consuming the software, never talking to anyone, never, I didn't get into the community. So, but it's been about 5 years. So long enough time, I think, to speak about it. And then obviously the new job at Automatic, it's sort of accelerating my community experience, going from kind of a still pretty much like an end user, even though I was more involved with talking to people, but now I'm much more of a sort of contributor level involvement.
Okay.
Interesting. So, yeah. For those of you that don't know, Automatic is a WordPress company. I don't know who wouldn't know that, but now you know.
You never do know. So
It's true. I'm full of gross generalizations today, apparently. So let's let's dive right in. This is a nice big rabbit hole to go down. What makes the WordPress community different?
Yeah, I think
in your opinion.
It's much larger in the sense that I think they put a really big emphasis on that sort of end user audience in the way that I think a lot of people who have Drupal sites are not necessarily going to DrupalCons or that kind of thing. So when you go to a WordCamp, which is their equivalent of a Drupal camp, and I'd go with Pantheon or whatever, and I'd be at the booth and I'd say like, hi, yeah, nice to meet you. What do you do? And they'd be like, I'm a doctor or I'm a travel blogger. I'm a cook. I'm a fitness instructor.
So it's more the content creators than the site builders necessarily. Well, I mean, they might be one and the same.
Yeah. I think in WordPress, they typically are more overlapping there than in Drupal. And they're more hooked into the software. Like they understand that a WordCamp would be productive for them. Whereas I think a lot of times people who are using Drupal sites don't necessarily realize they could go to DrupalCamp and learn something. So that was a real eye opener to me, was to realize that was like a large part of the audience and the community.
It's interesting because in my head, like the visual that I got when you were describing that was like two opposite. Why is Nick making that face?
It's just the in my head phrase. You never know what's gonna happen next on the show.
No. It's a 3-ring circus in there, but I'm pretty good. I'm pretty good at keeping it PG. So like I had this visual in my head of like two completely opposite ends of the spectrum, right? One being like the designer, content editor, front end part, and then the back end like code part. And I feel like Drupal and WordPress are at either ends, and throughout their lifetimes they've moved closer to like the middle, where it's like caring about all of those things, and now they're like maybe going in the opposite direction. But I don't know, maybe that's just me.
Yeah, it sounds like the easy out of the box initiative is kind of trying to put that focus back on the Drupal side for like the content creators, the editors. I mean, Drupal 7, Drupal 6, before that, Drupal is really good for that target market, I think. I mean, a lot of people started in Drupal just building a blog and adding some content to it and then adding some additional features. And Drupal 8 and 9 really, really pushed hard away from that market in general. I mean, there was some attempt to get that back with like Umami and some of that stuff, quick edit, all that stuff. But, the transition between that simple site and the more complex site just kind of disappeared for a while in Drupal 8. And I think that easy out of the box is trying to fix that.
I think it's also like a focus, right? So, Farah just was talking about how, WordPress is less developer focused, right? More focused on the end user. And I think when Drupal started, it was very developer focused. It was like, you can do anything. You build a module and you do whatever you want. And, I remember early on in my Drupal career, people saying like, we don't like Drupal because every Drupal site looks like Drupal. And I'm like, well, that's, and I remember working for a company where we kind of specialized in not making Drupal look like Drupal. That's what we did, and that was always the conversation. So yeah, it's interesting that like in the big matrix again, in my scary head, that, they're kind of crossover or dovetailing a little bit at this point.
So I'm curious about some of the details of that difference. So you mentioned that, the WordPress community is a bit more end user focused. How does that reflect on like the content of the camps then versus a Drupal camp?
Yeah. So content of a WordCamp typically has a lot of sort of business sessions, honestly. So many people who go are running their own business, and WordPress is a key part of that business strategy. And so, they're coming to learn about WordPress, but a lot of what they're learning is also marketing or sales funnels or that kind of stuff. And sometimes there's a technical element in terms of like this plugin will achieve that for you, or here's 5 plugins that will help you with marketing. But it's much more sort of business focused in a sort of small business kind of way. Not entirely, but a lot of it's that way. Yeah. And then there are technical talks at WordCamps for sure. As my job is to talk to developers in the WordPress space. And I think historically there hasn't been, in the way that like DrupalCon, if you want to talk about technical things, like there's a million technical talks at DrupalCon, right? Like you can go and learn everything, everything you need to know. There hasn't been that space for developers as much in the WordPress space. And so you have some like basic kind of security talks for people, because people are teaching themselves how to write a plugin by copying a plugin or by kind of reading the source code, and then they make mistakes, right? Because that's what happens when you learn that way. It's how I learned. And so it's kind of like gotchas in the security world, like don't use this function, don't use this hook. That should be reserved for core, that kind of stuff. But yeah, it's very different from a Drupal camp in my experience. I mean, every Drupal camp is sort of different, but.
Interesting. So I'm curious how much of that influence comes from Automattic itself, because one of the things that I noticed recently, I'm not part of the WordPress community. And obviously I am part of the Drupal community. I help, John and I are both on the team that helps organize the New England Drupal camp. And we were doing some research recently on something and found some information about community guidance from the WordPress community, in particular talking about WordCamp. And I don't remember the exact thing. We can add a link, but it said something like, it was like guidance from Automattic on whether or not communities could have meetups related to COVID. So like, here's what the guidelines are on whether you can have meetups or you can have camps. And it sounded like it was very much like, here's the guidance from above, like they oversee it, like they make that decision. Whereas on the Drupal side, it's really been, and maybe I'm just not aware of it, on the Drupal side, it's really been left up to individual camps on whether or not, like we made the decision internally to go virtual again this year, for safety reasons, but it wasn't like, I've not seen anywhere, the community working group or anything saying like, here's our guidance on whether or not you should have a local meetup in person or virtual. And I'm curious on, whether that's an intentional thing on Automattic's part, or if it just kind of, it organically happened that, Automattic is kind of managing the community like that.
Yeah. I mean, so a little bit about Automattic for listeners who may not know. The founder, one of the co-founders of the WordPress project, is the CEO of Automattic. So in that sense, it's a little bit like Acquia, being founded by Dries. So there's that kind of founder dynamic going on with the company. That said, the WordPress community is much more sort of centralized. I think more of the guidance comes from the WordPress Foundation, technically, who protects, I hope I'm not misspeaking. I'm so new. I'm still kind of like figuring out some of the stuff that I've learned through Drupal over the years. But camps is a really good example of where the communities diverge in terms of how they manage things, which is that the Drupal Association might have the ability to halt a camp, at least halt their use of the Drupal trademark or something if they didn't like what was happening. But I've never heard of them doing anything like that. And as you said, the event organizers are kind of all doing their own thing at all times, right? Like there's the newish, I say new, but I think it's like 2 years old, event organizers working group, right? But that was sort of grassroots. That wasn't from Acquia. It wasn't from the Drupal Association. That was from event organizers. In the WordCamp space, it is much more centralized under Matt as the project lead and under Josefa Hayden-Champolsi as the head of the WordPress Foundation. So what that means is there is a team that actually approves whether or not you can have a camp in general, COVID aside. And then of course, now during COVID, they have much more control over how you hold your camp, what your code of conduct is, what kind of sponsors you can have, how those sponsors can interact at the event. So it is much more, centralized. Like there just are rules that they want you to follow. If you wanted to have an event that was WordPress themed, you could do that. You'd have to use different branding and not use the WordPress trademark, I believe. So it's a very different feel coming from the Drupal community to have that. The community team that approves the events is an open team. It's not all automatic people.
Okay.
So there's kind of like still a mechanism to be involved in, say, helping with events. You don't have to work for Automatic to help on all these different teams.
Okay.
It's interesting working for Automatic. Like when I was talking about the job and thinking about taking it, I knew certainly in Drupal, there's always sort of conspiracy theories about Acquia pushing the project via Dries or via all these sponsored contributors, right? People are like, they want Drupal to reflect what their code, what their customer base can do. I would say in the WordPress project, those theories are like exponentially more popular and more complicated and more convoluted. My experience as a newish, like 6-week Automatic employee is that Automatic does have a lot of input into the project. And that's because they have paid, I think, almost 90 of us to be full-time contributors. Right. That said, yeah, it's a huge number. If you look at like number of WordPress sites and number of WordPress, like, I don't know how it compares to Drupal in terms of numbers, but it is a lot of folks. That said, I have not talked to anybody on the like commercial side of the company. I'm not getting any pressure from that side to release certain features. So I haven't seen a lot of sort of undue influence. I'm very much able to choose what I think is good for the community. And the goal is to keep WordPress going, to keep Gutenberg going.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. I mean, for one of the successes of Drupal or WordPress or any open source, semi-open source project is the community. And the community kind of has, for a community to actually be healthy and successful, it does have to have some sort of autonomy. And like you said, Automatic has the ability to influence WordPress as a whole, just because that's an enormous number of contributors. I mean, they can just, I mean, they if they need a feature or they need to take care of something, they have 90 full-time developers that they can be like, just put this feature in. And on some level, like, people really can't complain about that because they're the one doing that work, right? It'd be like complaining about some, larger Drupal agency building a module and essentially funding getting that into core or something. Like, they're supporting it. As long as they're supporting it, like, having that addition in the project generally is going to be helpful. That's fascinating. That's fascinating to me, though. It's always been fascinating to me how the two, like I said, be looking from the outside in on the WordPress side, seeing some of those changes. I wonder, there's definitely some pros to the difference. I'm wondering if you're seeing any cons to the more centralized process for WordCamps. Like, are the camps more similar to each other, whereas Drupal camps are a lot more diverse? And I'm talking about content, not really attendees.
I do feel like the camps are more similar to each other. It's not like you would see the same talk necessarily, like camp after camp. It's not like that. But because the project as a whole wants to emphasize that content creator, that end kind of user of WordPress, it does tend to focus, like I said, on these sort of business topics. Whereas I feel like a Drupal camp, I was in the Minnesota, Minneapolis, Twin Cities area Drupal community for a long time. And that community to me felt very kind of, this is admittedly also like Drupal 6-7 times. So it was a different community in general back then, but very focused on kind of welcoming beginners, welcoming people who are running their own Drupal site, like top to bottom, putting the content in, building the site, theming the site. It was very kind of small business focused. Then I moved to Los Angeles, and I felt like the Drupal community there was much more kind of enterprise level stuff, right? Like, it was good for me because I had gotten an enterprise kind of job. So it was useful. But it felt very different, right? Like, we're talking about like different kinds of SAML authentications and all this stuff that in Twin Cities Drupal, when I had been there, wouldn't have been a huge draw. Whereas I feel like WordCamps are pretty reliable in that way. Like, people kind of know what to expect. There's still different personalities and there's still, differences, but they are a little bit more sort of consistent across the board. So that's a bonus, right? Like, consistency is good for the project. It means that when somebody moves when they get to their new WordPress community, it's going to be similar. It's going to have similar policies and things, but also it does have a little less wiggle room to kind of serve niche audiences.
Okay.
I think there's also that kind of automatic presence, I think, is both good in terms of it provides so much infrastructure. So when I say 90 people, they're not all developers. There's also people running some of the infrastructure for like events, education, so it's kind of a diverse team that's supporting across the whole community. And that provides a lot of infrastructure that I feel like in Drupal, we don't really have. If somebody stops running a Drupal camp, like that might be the end of the Drupal camp. There's no sort of central entity to like keep it going. At the same time, I do think those sort of like, I said conspiracy theories, maybe that's a little bit dismissive, but concerns about central authority do flare up, right? And we do have them in Drupal, but not like that, because Dries is pretty hands-off, honestly.
We've kind of talked about, obviously, the differences between the two communities, how Automatic is supporting similarly or dissimilarly than Acquia. But I'm curious, coming back to our core topic here, like what, in your mind, what could the Drupal community learn from the WordPress community?
That's a great question. I feel the projects are like cousins, right? They're technically very similar, and yet it's also like family, where you fight about the differences and you're like, no, we aren't like that. We would never do that. I think Drupal has been learning from the WordPress community. This came up earlier, but like the Easy Out of the Box initiative, I think, is kind of connecting back to some of those people who, honestly, Drupal 8 and 9 both are really quite easy for the end user, in my experience, right? The problem is the site builders are like, I don't want to learn Composer. I don't want to. And so WordPress really has been extremely focused on backwards compatibility. I think we have backwards compatibility in WordPress to so we're at 5.9 is about to come out. 5.8 is where we are right now. I think backward compatibility goes back to like 3.6.
Oh, wow.
So really, really committed to that, really committed to people being able to hit the update button and not break anything. Since the majority of users are relatively non-technical, for whatever we want to define non-technical as. But it means that people can really kind of upgrade without fear. That's something I think the Drupal 9 kind of model is helping us with. I think we're learning there. And then I just think that focus on the end user having a sort of seamless experience instead of, oh, I thought I was supposed to update this, and now I have to call my development shop and pay for 20 hours of development work to undo like whatever thing I did. I think that's a real pain point in Drupal that we just haven't quite solved.
Yeah. And for our listeners, WordPress 3.6 came out in 2012. So
thank you.
That's 9 years of backwards compatibility.
Which
that's impressive.
I've heard from some can lead to bloat of WordPress, but we don't need to dig into that. I imagine like
it's not perfect.
Yeah, of course, nothing's perfect. But I mean, I think, at some point we're going to probably flip this question around, and maybe that's something that WordPress can learn from Drupal is like, hey, at some point you got to just stop supporting the old stuff and focus on the new stuff. I do think that you're right in the automatic update initiative that we're working, the Drupal community is working on right now. Being able to click that button and have the updates run and do it with Composer in the background, right? is the goal. We'll see if we can get there. But I'm interested. We talked to Chris Wells a couple of weeks ago about the project browser initiative. And I'm wondering if something like that exists in WordPress.
Project browser initiative. I'm so sorry, because I don't know this one.
It's basically a way to look up and install modules from within the Drupal UI. So the way they have it set up now is it's another tab on the install screen that lets you browse all of the modules in the ecosystem.
Okay, yeah. That has been that's a WordPress thing for sure. There's when you go to install a plugin, There's a sort of a plugins tab that will list all of your currently installed ones. Plugins are the same as modules in the WordPress space. And then there's a little add new box, which will connect. It basically displays everything from WordPress.org. And it'll it has some kind of sorting about, popular, commonly installed ones. You can also type in whatever you want. So yeah, that's been there. Sorry, my cat is super excited about this podcast. That's been there since I've been in WordPress, so about 5 years, at least, maybe longer. It's great. It's not as great when you put somebody on an environment with like a production lockdown kind of situation, because they're accustomed to installing plugins when they like, and it doesn't work anymore. So there's some kind of wonky things, but I think it really helps people extend their site while they're using their site, which is when they want to extend it.
It's interesting that, these two features that we kind of mentioned are getting a lot of attention now. We're working towards them. But taking that question and what the Drupal community can learn from the WordPress community, let's abstract out the technical aspect, right? Is there anything that comes to mind in the like community space that you think Drupal could learn from WordPress?
In the community space, I feel like both communities are doing good things. I think having people paid to support the community, whether that's at Acquia or some other Drupal company, especially right now, it's not something I think I necessarily believe should always be a thing. But during COVID, I'm seeing in both communities just really low volunteer engagement, like really, really low volunteer engagement. I think part of that is it's easier to sign up for something when you're at DrupalCon, or you just got home from DrupalCon and you're like hyped about the project and you want to give back, and those aren't happening. Like online events are not working as well to get volunteers. And so right now I feel like certain things in Drupal are just stopped because nobody wants to do them, because everybody's like, I want to go sit outside or be with my kids or just do literally anything else than work on a computer longer. So I think in WordPress, there's this thing called Five for the Future that was started by Matt Mullenweg, which is about dedicating 5% of your company's resources back to the project. So that can be in terms of human hours, right? So that's where these numbers, where I can say like, we have 90 people. That's because it's 5% of the total employee base at Automatic. And so it's a very clear number for them to hit. It's like, okay, well, we hired 100 new people. That means we need 5 more contributors. 95 and 5, but that project I think has really, it's not required. It's not like that, but I've started to see more and more companies hiring full-time WordPress contributors in all kinds of spaces, not just technical. I think we could do a little bit more of that in Drupal. There's so many people who are doing this on the sides and on weekends, and you just burn out. Like it's human, right? You can't not. So I'd like to see more paid contribution.
I think we should roll out 8 to make Drupal great.
Yeah.
There it is. There it is. Dries, you can
heard it here
that.
first.
I won't claim any creation of that. Just use it. Go with it.
John Picosi presents 8 to make Drupal great.
That's my next. It's gonna be my DrupalCon presentation.
I'm here for it. I'll attend.
So I'm wondering how much crossover there is between the two communities, and I mean like people. So obviously you're part of both communities, and we've had guests on that are in both part of the communities. But how? I'm curious about 2 parts of that. One is like, how many people are you seeing in WordPress camps and events that you would see at a Drupal one, and what's their level of contribution too? Because some of the people that contribute a ton of stuff to Drupal, they're not going to have the time to contribute a ton to WordPress and vice versa. So I'm wondering if there's or crossover in roles. Like, do you find people that are doing one thing in Drupal are doing the same type of thing in WordPress? Or
I think I don't see. I mean, I haven't been doing an event in a long time, but I think a few people, maybe at a given event of 200 people, I might see 5 or 6 people that I know from the Drupal community. I think it's more common than it sounds in terms of people are doing it at work. Like more agencies are landing WordPress and Drupal contracts because they're not that different.
Okay.
WordPress talent is generally a little easier to find and a little cheaper than Drupal talent. And so I think when somebody comes knocking, they want to do a WordPress build, it's easier to spin up like a WordPress team. I think I'm not involved in hiring for an agency, but that's what I'm hearing. But I don't know that there's not a lot of people who like to identify as both. And speaking as someone who does kind of publicly have a foot in both communities, it's like everywhere you go, people are a little suspicious. So I think a lot of times in terms of meetups and stuff, people won't have a very public profile in the other community. I've also met people who are formal Drupal people in the WordPress community, where especially the Drupal 7 to 8 transition pushed them out. So I've been meeting people who are like, oh, I used to do Drupal. It was great. But now I do WordPress because I couldn't make the jump. So that's been an interesting experience for sure.
It's interesting because one person that comes to mind, and I know that she just spoke at WordCamp US. Is that a thing?
That just happened, last week.
Yeah. Well, is Amy June, and I think it's I think you're talking about going to a camp and like having people be naturally suspicious that you're some sort of double agent is a funny premise. But like I think Amy June's pretty open about the fact that she's in she's in both places. To be fair, between the two of you, you're the only folks that come to mind right now for me. But anyway, so I'm wondering, let's turn the question around, my last question around now. Is there anything you think that the WordPress community could learn from the Drupal community?
Yep. I think actually
yes, there is.
Yep, there is. Well, it's kind of my job right now to do that, which is to say, I've been thinking a lot about the Drupal 7 to 8 transition, right? Because like I said, I've been meeting people who left the community then, and I feel like in some ways, Drupal is starting to implement this kind of backwards compatibility that smooths these bumps out, right? And WordPress is starting to say, no, we need to do the hard thing, right? Which is sort of what the Drupal 7 to 8 transition was
right.
We need to modernize and do the hard thing, even though it's going to be tough for a lot of people. And so I'm personally sort of spending a lot of time thinking back to what it was like for me as a small business owner in the Drupal 7 era, trying to move into Drupal 8 and going to DrupalCon and hearing about the fork and going to contentious meetings and trying to decide, am I going to learn object-oriented programming or not? Because I taught myself, right? And so I was like, okay, finally got up to speed with Drupal 7. It's all gone, right? It's like, that's what it felt like. Just sort of like, I can barely keep up with billing. I don't know how I'm supposed to also learn an entirely new framework on top of that. So, thinking about how I did that and how kind of I can help other people, because I think it's a very similar transition to what WordPress is going through right now. People are like, WordPress used to be easy. Now it's really hard, which I heard a ton about with the Drupal 7 transition to 8, right? Like it used to be easy to build Drupal sites. Now it's hard. So learning my lessons of sort of the fear, uncertainty, and doubt of the time, and how some of it is founded and some of it's really not, and how to talk to people. And then also, what are the tools that I used to actually make that transition, which was a lot more like structured learning instead of self-teaching, instead of going to camps and cons and trying to figure it out. So I think right now there's a lot of kind of like change management in open source, a lot of helping people find their kind of like bridge across to this new framework. And so I think Drupal did that, and we did lose people. Like, it's not like we did it perfectly, but I think as a community, we did learn a lot about how to publicize changes, bring people in earlier, build tooling to help, right? Like the initiatives that have been in Drupal over the years around like, these modules are ready for Drupal 8, these modules are not. And like this bar is ticking upward as people are converting, and making it simple for people to convert. A lot of that stuff that we went through as a community, I think is going to apply to the WordPress space now. So definitely thinking a lot about those things.
So do you think, I want to dig into a couple of different areas there. Do you think that, well, two things, I guess, right off the bat. Do you think that the WordPress community will pull off that Band-Aid in the near future? And when they do you think they will be able to do it better than Drupal did?
I hope so, just because it's my job to make sure it's better. Yeah. So in the same way that Drupal 7 is going to be end of life, or, enter sort of long-term support next year, I believe. The classic editor, which is sort of the fallback option for people who don't want to move to Gutenberg. They did just extend the deadline for long-term support, or for end of life kind of for that editor. So the Band-Aid will be coming off sooner or later, but I do think the launch of Gutenberg was a bit rough for the community, much in the same way that the Drupal 7 switch over was rough. And I do see project leadership really learning from that, and learning that you have to listen more. I think they were listening, but so I see a lot of listening and a lot of investment in ensuring that developers really have what they need. And that's in the form of like the work I'm personally doing, but also there's learn.wordpress.org, which is a sort of community-owned resource for official learning that's free. It has a lot of resources behind that as well. So I'm hopeful that they can do it. I think one of the struggles that, again, learning from Drupal is that I've sort of said several times, the WordPress community is focused on the end user. We're sort of building the capacity to talk to developers in the community, because it's been sort of this nebulous, we know there are WordPress developers, but we're not necessarily gathering them in one place, talking about what's going on. There's sort of a lot of contributor talk, people who are building the software, and then people who are using the software. And that middle group, I think we don't have a great mechanism for speaking with, which is something Drupal's always been really good at, is speaking to developers. So hopeful we can kind of make the transition a little less painful for people, and keep the community sort of, I think it'll stay vibrant. It's such a big project. It's not going anywhere, but keep those people who really have historically loved WordPress involved. Because it is sad to me. It's sad when I see old time Drupal people who are just like, I'm done. I don't want to anymore. So
I'm sorry, as a Drupal enthusiast and a big old jerk. When you were like, hey, people left from the Drupal 7 to Drupal 8 migration, people left and went to WordPress. I'm kind of like, oh great, now's our chance to get them back. They'll be mad because WordPress are changing, and they'll come back to Drupal because we're it's easier to upgrade, easier air quotes to upgrade now. So we'll see.
I mean, I'm happy with them just not going to Wix or Squarespace, right?
Oh, gosh.
Like that's where I want. I'm like, I don't care which CMS you use, just don't build a Facebook page for your business.
Squarespace has a place for certain folks.
For sure.
I've used it before, but Wix is where I draw the line.
Same. Oh.
So you've mentioned a couple of struggles that both the communities have. One is low engagement right now because virtual events are kind of wearing thin, and then big changes, community-wide platform level changes are always difficult. Are there any other challenges that are the communities are kind of going through right now that you're kind of managing and keeping an eye on and trying to think problem solve about?
Yeah, I think both communities are trying to work on diversity and inclusion. And, to varying degrees of success, I don't think that they're failing at it. In the WordPress space, it's been much more focused around events and helping people get the confidence to speak, and then helping event organizers write things so that underrepresented people apply. So there's been a lot of focus around events, which I think makes sense because that's also where you get contributors. And it's also, in the Drupal space, it's been much more grassroots and much more kind of focused, maybe focus isn't the right word, but working in a lot of different areas, contribution or that kind of thing. So it's been a different approach, but definitely both communities dealing with the same thing.
Are there any blog posts on like WordPress that are open about some of the ways to word things? I mean, I know we in NetCamp, it's something that we talk about every year and strategize about. I'd definitely be curious as an organizer to see how other communities are handling that.
Yeah, I will. I'll look for a blog post for you. At the very least, I can share a link to the group that's organizing these trainings.
Okay.
We did bring their speaker training to the Drupal space. So that was for underrepresented people, like helping brainstorm topic ideas, get over imposter syndrome. So I'm sure if we wanted to bring the sort of like event organizer or allyship work that they're doing as well over, that's totally a thing that could be done. But I have not personally made any inroads there.
So do they have do they have like an equivalent, like Drupal has the Drupal diversity inclusion team? Does WordPress have an equivalent group, or is that just, part of the event group in general?
It's a subgroup of the community team. So it's called WP Diversity. It's run by an awesome woman named Jill Binder. Again, with like the way things work, it's much more centralized and part of the formal structure than Drupal diversity and inclusion, which is very much just community members.
I thought you were going to tell me that it was called WordPress Inclusion and Diversity. I was going to say. Okay, amazing. WordPress, put your dukes up. So one thing that comes to mind, and I think this comes to mind for everybody that works in open source, is sustainability. And when you are working with a platform like Drupal or WordPress, platform sustainability comes creeping in at some point. I know, at least at one point, this was true, that WordPress has a kind of like a paid module ecosystem. Plugin ecosystem. There are free plugins available, obviously, that you can get and install and use. But some of them are paid, and the ones that are paid, have support levels and all that sort of stuff. Obviously in Drupal, the module ecosystem is, for the most part, I would say 99 or 98%, free. And, you're really paying for somebody to implement and kind of put things together. Can you talk a little bit about the sustainability ecosystem within WordPress and maybe what Drupal could learn or might want to learn from that?
Yeah, so you're totally spot on, which is, I don't remember ever using a paid plugin, paid module in the Drupal space. Maybe some point I did, but it's all free, right? Like it's all amazing stuff. And I think, things like views, which is now in core, right? All this stuff, these amazing modules that get released by the community and they get picked up and put into core, is an incredible strength of the Drupal community, right? It's really amazing to be able to just go, and every time somebody recommends a module to you, it's available on Drupal.org free of charge. Maybe you have to pay for some kind of storage service. Like there's things, but in general, it's free. In WordPress, there are still free plugins, but there is a vast ecosystem of people who are charging for their plugins, or they have like a freemium model where you can use the plugin, but if you really want X service that costs them extra for storage or whatever, you have to pay more. I go back and forth on this one. Coming from a Drupal background, it's very sort of disconcerting to see like unlock this plugin in my dashboard. I'm always just like, why is this happening? At the same time, there are a lot of people making money, decent money, like living, supporting their families from their plugins and their themes. And it makes WordPress adoption just so much easier. You can pay let's say you want to spend $250 on your website, and you spend like $100 on a hosting account, and then you have $100 left to pay for a handful of plugins and themes. You can get a pretty nice website that does some kind of complicated things for that, right? And in Drupal, you can, depending on but I feel like there's a lot of knowledge barriers there in terms of how to set that up. So I both have this very open source kind of purist attitude that I would like it to all be free and open. And also I see the benefits that are accrued to the people who work on it. And I talk to people who are maintaining Drupal modules who are just like, I don't want to do this anymore, but nobody else will do it. And it's important that we have it. So I feel like the WordPress community as a whole is more willing to put money towards a problem, whether that's, like I said, sponsored contributions of people's salaries or paying people to use their software. And I think people in Drupal, like, we keep talking about it. Oh, is GitHub sponsorships going to do it? Is Open Collective going to be the thing? Is Patreon going to be the thing? But I think the community is accustomed to not paying directly for the specific code. And if I could sort of like magic my perfect CMS into existence, there would be open modules, open plugins that were free of charge. Because the other thing is there's a proliferation effect, right? When you can get paid for your special thing, now there's 700 contact form plugins, right?
Yeah.
Like, because people are motivated to keep theirs, it's differentiated in some way. So I kind of prefer the Drupal way. It's cleaner, easier. If you want a form, people are going to suggest web form, right? Like, it's not as complicated. Whereas in WordPress, it's like this ecosystem versus this ecosystem. So I prefer the simpler way, but I also think people need to get paid. And so I would rather it be the Drupal way with people more actively offering support, but
yeah,
maybe someday.
I think I agree with you. And now the 8 to make Drupal great, what initiative needs to get started, because that's going to be a great way to help out with our sustainability.
Yeah, exactly.
That's 8 to make Drupal great TM, by the way.
So I'm curious about size of communities and if you think that has any effect, because I mean, WordPress obviously has an install base and its community is just larger. And I think pretty much always has been. And I'm curious about if there's anything unique about the WordPress community or the Drupal community for that matter, just because of their relative sizes that you've noticed.
I think that the Drupal community is like, it's easier to kind of make your way in because it's not quite so big. You put your hand up a couple times in the Drupal community and people will start to kind of know who you are and connect you with other people, in my experience. Whereas the WordPress community is so big, there's absolutely no names, but there's just so many of them that it's harder to kind of, I think, find a place to really sort of make your mark in that community. You're going to be a small fish in a big pond. But I think WordPress is also really welcoming, really focused on the community side, and almost, I don't know if I'd say less than the code side, but certainly less than Drupal is focused on the code side. In my time in the Drupal community, it's sort of been like, oh, we have code sprints for DrupalCon. And we've started to kind of be able to speak about it in a more general sense. But as somebody who has worked as a core mentor for a long time, trying to actually curate activities for people who are not coders is a whole ball of wax that is not very simple. And in the WordPress community, they've put a lot of things in place to get people who are marketers or just sort of like non-technical people of any bent involved, whether that's translating. So for example, in Drupal, when we announce something, it comes out in English. Maybe local communities might translate it to another language. I haven't seen that much. In WordPress, they have a whole system for if the 5.9 release comes out that's in English, they have formal committees that are translating into Japanese, into Spanish, to share with their local communities. A lot of ways. Yeah, it's super cool. And it's beyond just like major releases. It's all kinds of information is getting translated into the top languages. So there's a lot of stuff that you can do to get involved in WordPress that I think they've just really sort of built the infrastructure for people to get involved and stay involved. That I think, because a lot of Drupal people are volunteers, we don't have the time to devote to that infrastructure.
Well, Tara, thank you for joining us for these last 4 weeks. It's been a pleasure. I have one final question though for you before we close out the show, and that is there a Talking WordPress podcast?
There's not a Talking WordPress podcast. There are, I think, like 30 WordPress podcasts.
Oh, wow.
There's a lot. Yeah. But none of them are called Talking WordPress. So you still have namespace there if you want to go take it and start talking WordPress. But yeah, there's a number of WordPress podcasts in the world.
So this is Talking WordPress, a group of guys that know nothing about WordPress, but are going to talk about it anyway. Join us as we learn the ropes.
Be a fun journey.
It'll be interesting.
Sorry, I'm just jotting down Talking WordPress. Just jotting that down. Maybe Tara could be a host of that in some future version.
Sure, let's do it.
I actually had a question about the translation thing. I thought was pretty cool. I know Nick's bringing us in for a landing here, but we're gonna take off again, circle back, and come back down. Interesting. So they have this whole translation thing happening. I actually just went to Drupal.org to see if Drupal.org was translated, and it does not appear to be, unless I'm missing the ability to do that somehow. But I've
never seen it.
Yeah, it would be super interesting for Drupal.org to team up with one of our fabulous translation services and get that translated. So that's something that one community could learn from another right there, I think.
Yeah.
Oh, wow. That just totally blew my mind. Anyway, I'd like to echo Nick's thanks, Tara. It's been great having you on for the last 4 weeks. And, hopefully you'll come on again to give us an update on how things are going with Gutenberg and whatnot.
Yeah, it's been a really fun month, and I appreciate y'all having me here.
Do you have questions or feedback? Reach out to Talking Drupal on Twitter with the handle Talking Drupal, or via email at show@talkingdrupal.com. You can connect with our hosts and other listeners on Drupal Slack in the Talking Drupal channel. If you're interested in show news and updates, sign up for our newsletter at talkingdrupal.com/newsletter.
You can promote your Drupal camp at Talking Drupal. You can learn more about this at talkingdrupal.com/camp promo.
Thank you, patrons, for supporting Talking Drupal. Your support is greatly appreciated. You can learn more about becoming a patron at talkingdrupal.com and choosing the Become a Patron button. You get an extended recording of the show, and today I will tell you it was interesting. So there's some benefits to being a patron. So let's close out the show as we normally do, and just tell everybody where people can find us. Tara, where can people find you if they have questions, they want to talk about converting to WordPress, any of those things?
Yeah, I am at Sparkling Robots everywhere on the internet, Twitter, Drupal.org, Drupal Slack, and you can email me at tara.king, so it's tara.king @automatic.com, which has 2 T's at the end, AUTOMATTIC.
So just out of curiosity, does the WordPress community have like screen names? Like, are you Sparkling Robots in the WordPress community as well?
I am. Yep. Okay. They are very similar in that way. So don't worry, I'm still myself.
There you go. That's good. Nick, what about you?
You can find me pretty much everywhere at Nixvan, NICXVAN.
And as usual, I'm John Picozzi. You can find me on all the social networks and Drupal.org at John Picozzi. And you can find out about EPAM at epam.com.
If you've enjoyed listening, we've enjoyed talking.